unique situation where these two portions, Vayakal Pekuday, which usually are read together, this year we have them separate, so it gives us the ability to focus on Pekuday.
How often are they read together? It's not because it's an every year.
Because it's an every year. So it comes out that every 19, there's a 19-year cycle. 7 out of those years, we're going to have them standing on their own. So we are the Hebrew year, and therefore we have it. It's interesting that the rabbis link this portion, Parshas Pekuday, to the Amidah, to the Shmoneh Esrei. How do they link it? Because if you look in the portion, the words Ka'asher Tziva Hashem et Moshe, that throughout this portion they are told to construct specific vessels, make specific vestments, and after every paragraph, if you look carefully, like if you turn, for example, to page 532, at the end of verse 5, where in verse 5 they make this belt, which has within it the linen, the scarlet wool, the purple, turquoise, and all that was done as Hashem commanded Moshe. Kasher Tziva Hashem et Moshe. They were all constructed as commanded. When you construct something due to the fact that the higher being commands you to do so, it is a way of connecting to that higher being. And that's what our Shmoneh Esrei, that's what our prayer is about. Our prayers are not just for us, but for us to connect and for us to do for the sake of God. So they link this portion to prayer, which will play a significant role in our understanding of the main theme of a portion that ends the book of Shemot. There's a lot of talk in this day and age about transparency or in financial matters. Institutions need to have open books, that people should know that they're not playing games. Even non-profit organizations, right, need to have books that there should be no suspicion of the individuals who are running the finances. There's going to be a little bit of a to-do in town. There's going to be a to-do in town, in this town, very soon, about the COR, right? Familiar with the COR? Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, he's very familiar with the COR. This is the only town that has a Red Lobster under the COR, because if you look at the building where the COR offices are, on the main floor, it's really there's a Red Lobster that's just under the COR. So it's a very unique city. But they're going to have a little bit of a different to-do, and it relates to the fact that one of the local Jewish papers is going to run some issues that relate to finances. And the COR is responding in a way that I'm happy about, that they're going to be putting out an ad of spelling out the issue. The issue relates to the fact that the COR was under Congress until about 16 years ago. They went on their own. The COR was running the surplus throughout the years that they were under the Congress. You invest wisely the few dollars that added up weekly, and it was a significant amount of money that was given by Congress to the COR to go ahead and establish itself as an independent organization. It was growing. The COR is the largest food service hashgacha in the world. In other words, the OU is larger when it comes to companies, but when it comes to food service, restaurants, caterers, nursing homes, hospitals, the COR is the largest in the world. So they need to function independently. You have to have many professionals working for them. And when they established their independence from the Congress, they got funds from the Congress. And it seems to be that there's going to be a little bit of a to-do relating to those funds. So the COR is going to be putting out a full-page ad. It's all off the record, even though it is recorded. That the COR is going to be putting out a page adds, explaining these details in a very honorable way of what the history is about, and being honest about the fact that there were funds that were given to the organization to establish itself, and it's being done in a very proper way, in my humble opinion, and that's transparency. Now, where do we find this idea of transparency in Jewish tradition? In this week's Parsha, right? That we are told that Moshe Rabbeinu goes ahead and gives a complete accounting, gets the Jewish accountants to work things out. Eile Pekuday HaMishkan, that these are the reckonings of the tabernacle. Mishkan HaEdut, this is the tabernacle of testimony, due to the fact that it had those stones. If we're on page 530, the stones given by God, known as the tablets, they are testimony to the world that we have a unique relationship to God. And therefore, this is a tabernacle that is built around these tablets. So the whole tabernacle, the whole Mishkan, is a Mishkan of Edut, of testimony. And you should know that the accounting, the reckoning, were done by the guidance of Moshe. That's what we are told. God commands that it should be so, and Moshe plays the role as the one that's giving full reckoning. So the rabbinic authorities share with us that this is the source for transparency, that if you are dealing with communal funds, you have the responsibility of being open with them and sharing what exactly is being used for what, that there should be no suspicion. Now, it's interesting that in Jewish law, we are told that the community has no right to go ahead and challenge the leaders. In other words, if there is a situation where there is a leader that is dealing with funds, the congregation has no right to turn to him and say, go ahead and open your books, but he has the responsibility of doing it. Meaning it should not be, the pressure should not be coming from the bottom, but it should be given from the top, which is a very healthy system where you have honesty not being demanded, but someone feels that this is indeed the right thing to do. This is what Moshe Rabbeinu does in this week's portion. Opens his books, transparency. He shows that he is honest. There is a concept in Jewish law, in Jewish tradition called Vehitem Neki'im, that we have the responsibility of being clean in the eyes of Israel. In other words, our responsibility is not just that God should view us as pure beings. We have the responsibility to act in a way that others as well should see our actions as pure, as kosher. We should be kosher and yosher, right? That's very important in our Jewish tradition. Here we have a source for it. There's a statement by the Chassam Sofer, the great rabbi, in the beginning of the 19th century, that it's much harder to please Jewish people than to please God. In other words, to be clean in the eyes of God is doable. To be clean in the eyes of the nation of Israel, close to impossible. That's what he notes about our wonderful nation. But the question we're going to ask is this week's portion. So we have this theme of the prayer of the Shemona Esrei, correct? Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe appears 19 times, corresponds to the 19 of Shemona Esrei. It relates to it. This portion is also teaching us that there is a need for honesty and to remain kosher in the eyes of the public and to have transparency. What is it about this portion that it is chosen to be the source for these important concepts? That's what we're going to try to figure out. Okay? Now, if you look carefully in the verse, the first verse, Eile Pekuday HaMishkan, okay, we're dealing with the reckoning of the tabernacle. Mishkan HaEdut, the tabernacle of testimony. So the commentators ask the following question. It could have presented the Mishkan as Mishkan HaEdut and just written Eile Pekuday Mishkan HaEdut. Why mention the word Mishkan twice? Logical question. So, Rashi shares with us from an earlier Medrash that the reason the word Mishkan is mentioned twice because the word Mishkan relates to another word in Hebrew, which is the word Mashkon. Mashkon is a collateral, is a security. Right? If I want to go ahead and borrow funds from a bank. They ask me, what's your equity, right? What kind of securities do we have? So the Mishkan actually served as a mashkon, as a security. Securities are taken when you don't pay up, when you're not fulfilling your responsibility. The Mishkan, which eventually turned into the Mikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, that too served as a security, that when we were not fulfilling our responsibility, God took his security. It was done not once, but twice. So therefore the word Mishkan appears twice. Okay, piece of information number one that we need to put things together. Now, number two, the last few words of the book of Bereshit, the last few verses tell us about Yosef. So we're going to visit the end of Bereshit, where Yosef is dying. He is the leader of his nation, of his tribe, we should say. And he tells them, listen, we're in Egypt here. Things are doing well. We feel secure here. It's a great homeland. I work things out as prime minister for this country for the last few decades. But let me tell you something. One day, we're going to be leaving this country. And a leader is going to come with these code words. And when this leader presents these code words, you'll know that he is the real one. He's the chosen one who will get you out of here. Now, what are those code words that are going to be used by a leader to free or to indicate that he is the one that is sent by God to free you? So on page 288, I'll read it to you if you don't want to turn back. Vayomer Yosef Elachav. Yosef tells his brothers, listen, Anochi met, I'm going to die. Ve'elokim, but when it comes to God, Pakod ifkod etchem. He shall surely redeem you. He will surely remember you. And when you have that Pakod ifkod, when you are indeed remembered by God, do me a favor, take my remains with you. Right now you can't, but at that point take the remains with me. And those are the words that Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the people of Israel. He is told to turn to them and say that God has indeed pakod ifkod etchem. It's time for that remembrance. Pakod is a word that means remembrance. Now, we have another word that means remembrance, so that is zachor. What is the difference between zachor and pakad? Pakad appears so much throughout our tradition and our prayers. What's the difference between the two? So the difference is that when I remember something, even if I plan to act, right, I remember that someone was kind to me a few years ago, and I decide that it's a nice thing to send them shalach manos. Right, that's what I'm planning to do. But you know what happens? Come Purim, right, and by midday, I don't remember things as much by midday Purim, right after a glass or two of wine. And therefore, there's no, yes, I remembered, but there's always going to be a gap between remembrance and action. That's how we humans work. There are no guarantees. Right? There's a story of one rabbinic authority who was walking in Tsarist Russia down the street, and an official stopped him and asked him, where are you going? And he says, where am I going? I don't know. So the official got extremely upset at him, and he arrested him and took him to jail, and he met a higher official, and the higher official asked him, where were you planning to go? He said, well, I was planning to go to the synagogue. So he said, so why did you not just tell the officer that you're going to the synagogue? So he responds, well, the officer asked me where I'm going. Well, where I'm going, a person never knows for sure. Look, I was planning to go to the synagogue and I landed up in jail. Right? So there's no way of knowing things. Where I plan to go, that's very different. So that's a little maisala that they tell kids, but there's truth in it, that we cannot guarantee anything. And even when we remember and plan to act, what we have basically is remembrance. There is only one being that has the ability to remember and act based on it. God. So therefore, God is the one who could be Yifkod, right? He's a Zachor, but he can upgrade it to a Pakad, to Vayifkod. So that's remembrance with the ability to act. And you have to, and that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was telling the people of Israel when he greets them, when he meets them. This is a nation in Egypt that unfortunately is pagan. This is a nation that the values and the philosophy of the Egyptians is very much part of their philosophy. So they need to be educated. And you need to educate them that the God that we are introducing to you, the God of your grandparents and great-grandparents, he is a God that has the ability to act, and he's the only one that can act. Nothing can stop him. So when Moshe Rabbeinu comes with those words of Pakod ifkod etchem, it's not just a code word. It's a message that you should know that this God that you're going to relate to is not limited. The forces that you worship here in Egypt, Nile, Pharaoh, the crocodile head, Ra, whatever you worship here in Egypt has its limitations. When it comes to the God of Israel, he is not limited. Pakod ifkod is really education. But Pakod ifkod is an idea and becomes a code word for the concept that even if we go ahead and we are in an existence that is very far from our ideal, we are in exile, we always have to remember that there's a Pakod ifkod, that God has that ability and there is a guarantee that we're going to return home. So now if you look at the first verse here mentions the fact that there is a collateral, that I'm creating here a security. This verse is also presenting the word of pakod. It is a verse that is used to remind the people of Israel that when they are away, there is nevertheless a guarantee that they're going to return. That in future exiles as well, do not think that existence, right, in Europe, in North Africa, in Arab countries, don't think that existence in the exile is there forever. There's always a ifkod. So there are several references in the first verse about exile. Several references. Mashkon, the collateral. Pakod, exile. Why is there so much reference to exile when this is a portion that is going to land up with the construction of our Mishkan, which turns into Beis HaMikdash? I mean, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with it. I would expect all themes to relate to the positive existence, the ideal existence, where the Jewish people are where they belong. Why is it so? So, the answer is, collaterals, there are guidelines in halacha what you are allowed to take as a collateral. In other words, if I lend someone $1,000 and I come into their home, I am only allowed to take items that are not a necessity. If they are items that shet chayei nefesh tluim b'hem, in other words, if I walk into their home and I take their oven, that's prohibited. Now it's debatable what's considered a must to live with. In other words, I remember when I arrived in Memphis over 10 years ago, it was right after this massive storm that we had. So I met one of the neighbors, not a Jewish fellow, and I say to him, so how did you survive this storm? And he said, it was awful, he said, because basically it was close to 3 weeks with no cable. No cable for 3 weeks. I mean, that was the end of the world for him. So I don't know if cable, in other words, halachically speaking, I would have to ask a posik to walk. If someone owes me $1,000 and to walk into their house and to take their Xbox or their TV, right now they have even wireless TV now, right? That you can go ahead and actually move it. So I don't know what the halacha would be, but obviously there's no question that chayei nefesh, things that are your essence and the way you survive, cannot become collaterals. It's not right. You don't have the right to do so. So now, is the temple in Jerusalem, the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness, the temple, the Bet HaMikdash in Jerusalem, is that for us something that is chayei nefesh? In other words, can we survive without a temple? We have. Right? That's the right answer. We have survived without a temple. But when you are presenting this nation, right, a nation that lives in an environment that the pagan temple is the source of their life, you cannot live if you have a pagan education. And you have to remember, as the Rambam points out, that a lot of these mitzvos that are given to the people of Israel are due to the fact that they think as people thought 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And their thinking worked in a specific way, and you had to, at times, take practices that were part of their lifestyle and use, unfortunately, for pagan worship. And Hashem says, you know what, don't do that for a pagan worship, do it for my sake. In other words, that's how Rambam sees many of the practices that are irrational in the Torah, and even korbanot. So here is a nation that is going to construct the tabernacle. The norm would have been, the attitude, the natural attitude would have been for people that existed then, we're building this tabernacle, but without it, there's nothing. In other words, this is not just a structure to keep us together. We cannot survive spiritually without it. God needs to educate the people of Israel that temples are important, that to have a center where we connect to God, extremely significant. We're going to pray for it 3 times a day, that God returns us to the land of Israel to be able to construct such a structure. But guess what? We can actually survive as a nation. We could survive as beings that connect to the higher being. We could, even without it. And to prove it to you, I am going to label this Mishkan Mashkon. I'm going to label it as something that can be taken as a security. If it can be taken as a security, so obviously it is something that's important, that's good to have, but it's not a necessity. We could survive without it. And there's education there, because we suddenly learn what's the essence of Judaism. The essence of Judaism is not the structure and not the person. Rather, the essence is a relationship with God. One of the tools, and the greatest of the tools, is that temple in Jerusalem, or at this point in history, the tabernacle in the wilderness. But it is a tool, not the essence of your existence. Last Shabbos, I mentioned the fact that if you look at Parshat Vayakel, it begins with an assembly. The nation of Israel gets together and hears about Shabbos, the importance of Shabbos, and then it moves on to the construction of the tabernacle. The idea is Shabbos is actually our essence. The tabernacle, the Mishkan, and eventually the Beit HaMikdash, assists us in our existence. But before you have existence, you have essence. Right? We as Jews believe that our essence precedes our existence. There was a great philosopher in France, Jean-Paul Sartre, and one of his teachings, Pashut teachings that is studied in detail, is that our existence precedes our essence, but in Judaism we teach it the other way around. That you first have to know what your essence is, and it's not that structure. It could be a collateral. It could be taken from you. And it could be that you're going to go ahead and remember it and study it as a Pekuday. You're going to study about this collateral called the Mishkan, and you're going to study it and you're going to link it to the word Pekuday, which links to the word Pakod Yifkod, which is a guarantee that's going to return. It's going to return. In other words, we are not saying that it's not significant and therefore we don't need it. No, it's not significant. We survive, but we will always keep it as part of our tradition and our faith by linking it to the word Pekuday, which means V'Hashem Pakod Yifkod, which is that God guarantees. It is a remembrance and a guarantee that it is going to return. So this is the introduction to this week's portion. It's an introduction to this week's portion that it is teaching us. It's a wonderful structure, but we actually could do without it. You know, towards the end of the 19th century, our Jewish world in Lithuania is falling apart. Right? Our Jewish world already fell apart in other areas. In other words, when you have what the pogroms physically, but spiritually as well. We had our challenges with the Enlightenment, that it was very hard to have the next generation valuing what we valued, right? And they did not yet develop the tools to balance the two together. I remember reading that there was a philosopher in France, I think it was Henry Bergson, and he was the big philosopher that talked about duration and time. And it notes that he grew up in a traditional home, but at that time, towards the end of the 19th century, the works of Darwin were circulating, and he believed that it just won't work. In other words, you cannot bring science and faith of Torah together, so he had to reject one of them, so he rejected Torah. And I think nowadays we, Baruch Hashem, do have such literature like Rabbi Slivkin did, which is very useful for people that struggle with these issues. We have literature that actually deals with it. It was not in existence in the 1880s and the 1890s, so it was viewed as a contradiction, right? So there were communities that were collapsing. It was extremely challenging to keep our values for our children and our grandchildren during that period of time. But as a result, unfortunately, the traditional community and the yeshivot went into defensive/paranoid mode. There's a mode that we have, something we click here, and we become defensive and then we become paranoid. Right? When that's the way you are defensive, that you're sure that someone's coming to attack you. Now, once in a while, even paranoid people are attacked, but the reality is that the paranoia causes a tremendous amount of tension and strife within the community, that whenever they would see someone that does not fit into their view of Judaism, they would label them as heretics. This was a major problem, perhaps is still in existence, that if I encounter someone that thinks a little bit different than me, addresses a little bit different than me, if I'm not rooted well in the essence of my faith, the results could be that I'm going to be labeling them as ones that are not part of the tradition. Okay? Challenge that we have dealt with and we deal with. So there was a great rabbi, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva, that addressed that issue. And he addressed it in many ways, and often by reading historical text based on the modern problems. For example, in his introduction to his commentary on Chumash, he notes that the book of Bereshit in later books of Tanakh is called Sefer HaYashar, the straight book. Why is Bereshit called Sefer HaYashar, he notes? So he explains that Avraham Avinu had to interact with people that had very diverse backgrounds, or even pagans that he had to interact with. But nevertheless, he had no problem of welcoming them into his home, communicating with them, respecting them, treating them with dignity. So that is Yashar, that is the straight way of dealing with people. And he notes that it's very different than an approach that whenever you're to interact with someone that's a little bit different than you label him immediately in Apikoros. So he is giving commentary to the Chumash, but he's really addressing, Europe in 1875. So this is an approach that he has, and you read into what is disturbing him.
Was he the same person, though, that shut down his yeshiva when they wanted to introduce a curriculum that contained secular subjects? He said, better to shut the yeshiva?
So there is the legend of what happened in 1892 with the closing of Volozhin, and then there are the historical facts. It is one of those fascinating topics that the legend does not fit in completely with the facts. It wasn't a rejection of secular. It was a rejection of having external forces dictating a schedule, but he had no issue with the secular studies. In other words, it's not an issue, it wasn't a rejection of secular studies. And to prove it, because he was very, very well versed in Russian philosophy, and he read a lot of books that were very common, and perhaps he had no issue at all with it. It was more the intermingling with scheduling. It's a good topic, by the way. The closing of the Volozhin Yeshiva of 1892, which really killed him because he was devastated, and within a couple of weeks, he passed away in that year. But it's interesting that you note that you brought up that topic. Now, he shares with us another fascinating statement, that you should know that the destruction of the temple, the second temple in Jerusalem, the Beit HaMikdash on Tisha B'Av, was not the worst thing in the world. It wasn't so bad. Why was it not so bad? He noted that it was a nation that were fighting with one another, killing one another, destroying one another. Everyone was labeling one another as a heretic. So therefore, we were no longer functioning. The structure was like an empty shell. To have a structure where we bring sacrifices, but to not get along, and it doesn't serve as a sukkot shalom, as a tent of peace, it serves no purpose. Better to go ahead and destroy it and then start anew. That's how he viewed the reality of a temple without a nation that is worthy of it. And that's basically the message here, that the essence of Judaism is righteousness, connecting to God, valuing one another, connecting to one another. The temple is there as a tool, but what is extremely dangerous in Judaism is when we take tools and we make them into the essence of the religion. That really is what destroys our religion. Even the concept of turning to great Torah leaders. Without doubt, we cannot survive without guidance. But when the Torah leader becomes what we worship, and therefore as a result it could lead to paganism, because people will start claiming that they heard specific things from the Torah leader. He never said it, or it's corrupted. And as a result, the pagan god, in other words, if I walk in and said the pagan god told me that from now on we're supposed to burn a specific book, right? You are basically turning the authority into paganism. It is something that we have to be extremely aware of in our Judaism, not to take the tool and make it into the essence of our religion. And therefore, when the Mishkan is coming into play, when it's going to be constructed, this is a very exciting portion, by the way. When we say at the end of this week's Parsha, Chazak, Chazak, that finally we construct it and the cloud of glory comes and lays upon it, we're very excited at the end of this week's portion. But let's remember that this is not the whole religion. This is a tool within the religion. And we could survive without it. And if you ask, but wait a second, throughout the exile, if we don't have it, if it is indeed taken as a security, if it is indeed something that serves as a pikadon, as a mashkon, as a deposit, how are we going to turn to God? We ask as we begin reading this week's portion. So there's a reference in this week's portion to the Amidah, to the Shemon Esrei. In other words, the Jerusalem Talmud notes that if you read in this week's portion, you will see the words Ka'asher Tziva Hashem et Moshe 19 times, corresponding to the 19 blessings of the Shemon Esrei. That is a reminder that you could survive without the structure, but take the message that the goal is to connect to God, and that could be achieved with prayer. This is something that we find out mentioned often, that even in exile, discussing the korbanot, or praying to God, that serves, and that is a substitution for the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash. But this clarifies one other thing. When we are in the land of Israel, we find in our tradition that there is a link between the physical and the spiritual realm. In other words, when someone was acting in a way that was repulsive in the spiritual realm, something would appear and manifest itself in the physical as a sign that there's a spiritual flaw. It's a concept we don't relate to very well today because it doesn't work like that. Something that if we bring it into our way of thinking today could cause a lot of harm. But nevertheless, during the First Temple period, we do find the rabbis, and this is something that's even mentioned in the Torah, that if a person is stingy and is not going to go ahead and welcome others and share what he has, what will his house develop? Tzarat, some kind of leprosy of the wall. What? No good word for it. What happens if a person is socially agitating to others because he does not watch and guard the words that come out of his mouth? So it will manifest itself that he's going to develop some skin ailment that will cause him to be removed from the community. So there's a correspondence and a link between the spiritual and the physical. That existed then. And therefore, it's very possible that if you had leadership that was righteous, you sensed it. If you had phony leadership, you sensed it as well. Because the physical corresponded to the spiritual. Now, that does not work in the exile. And after the destruction of the first temple, when these vessels, we have to remember that the vessel that really made it into a Mishkan HaEdut, the vessel that made it into a structure of testimony that could testify to the world that the people of Israel have a relationship with God. The vessel that made it function, right, like in a computer, what would you say is the hard drive, you would say? No, I'm sorry, the Intel chip. The chip, that's the word we're looking for. It's good you're here. Could have been in Hawaii and I wasn't here. So the chip, the Intel chip of the structure of the Bet HaMikdash was the Luchos. When you don't have that chip in it, it was not the real thing anymore. And therefore the whole relationship and the concept of testimony, that the people of Israel can testify that they have a supernatural relationship with God, is gone. So therefore, as a result, you could have leaders that do not exactly match the ideal. They could become labeled as great Kabbalists, who you go to them and they could predict the future for you. And they're going to predict 10 times. 10 people are going to come in, right? And they're going to say to 10 of them 10 different things. And odds are that 5 of them are going to be correct. In other words, if I can predict, by the way, that the market is going up tomorrow. Now, let's say I say it to half of the crowd here that the market's going up tomorrow, and the other half I turn to you, and you don't, and of course you don't tell one another that the market is going down tomorrow. Half of you are going to think that I am smart. And then I take that group of half that's down to 20 now, let's say, and I split them again, and I say to someone's going up some next day. So eventually I will get, and imagine if I start off with 200,000 or 1 million. You realize that I could get people, I could have within that group people that for 14 days straight I could predict the market. So then I could turn to you and say, would you invest with me $1 million? Right? And of course you would, and then I booked my first class ticket to Argentina, and I live happily ever after. So that could be done, correct? And that exists in the Kabbalistic realm as well. That you go to a Kabbalist and you ask him for a bracha, a blessing, and he gives everyone a blessing. And after, on an average day, let's say 100 people go through, 2 of them actually got the blessing, and they're going to become the greatest righteous people. There is an issue that exists in our nation when we take the tools and we make them into the gods, and therefore we are warned specifically in this week's portion that is addressing this problem and this issue and the future of the people of Israel, that you should know transparency is required. Leaders have the responsibility of being open, and that's how they sanctify the name of God. Among the great rabbis in Israel now, there's a rabbi, he's about 100 years old. His name is Rabbi Aaron Leib Steinman. Israel TV a few weeks ago came into his apartment, this tiny apartment in Bnei Brak, where all the politicians make their visits and everyone comes for guidance. And they look at the walls, and of course all the paint is peeling, right? And it looks like a dilapidated structure. He's sitting in his quote-unquote office, which is basically his bed, a table, and a bunch of books. So the media asked his students there, why did they never fix up over the past? It looks like it hasn't been fixed for a long time. He said, yes, he moved in here about 50 years, but he does not he doesn't believe that we should waste any money on fixing it. And when there are donors that come from the U.S. and Canada and ask and beg, he says, absolutely not. He does not take a penny, would not take a penny for something that's not necessary. So he lives in poverty, but he inspires, because you walk in there, you have a sense that what's important for this man is the welfare of the people of Israel and the welfare of our faith. You walk, on the other hand, you walk into other individuals who live in wealth in a villa. Maybe they could do some hocus pocus on you, and maybe you're from the lucky guys that from the predictions he gives you, you could walk away with success. But the reality is that he will not be sanctifying the name of God with such actions. And let's remember the message of transparency, the message of what the temple is about and not about, and the fact that prayer is detailed in this week's portion, because we are told connecting to God is always doable wherever you are, whenever you are. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Yeah, yeah.